I was thinking all week about the Habsburgs. I like seeing Edward von Habsburg on Twitter and what he's doing. I like very much, but is not enough. I frequently encouraged him to take power, to organize his people for an uprising against the occupation regime now in charge of Austria, and to begin talks for the unity of the old Habsburg dominions in Europe. I think if you look at the Visegrad states, so called, at those members of the European Union who stand most strongly against the global faggot world order, these are Hungary, Poland, the former Czechoslovakia, and together maybe with Austria and Croatia, they could form a kind of federation within Europe that would uphold a less crazy form of democracy than exists in the West. It's very strange that it should be these states among all the others who are presenting the most effective resistance to global so-called liberalism, but which is really the new Soviet Union, and that it is these states that provide, it seems, an alternative that works, that allows a high standard of living, but also avoids those nasty elements that the gay Western elite tells us are unavoidable in modern life, part of modern big city life that you can't escape, they claim. They want to say, if you want modern, urban, and free form of living with economic opportunities, you have to accept terror attacks with regularity. They've said so many times. They say you must accept Sudanese and Balochis loitering on your downtown areas, or raising up tent cities like they do now in Los Angeles or Paris, which are soon to turn into permanent brick shantytowns or into favelas, I'm guessing. They say, like a mayor of London, that you have to accept knife attacks. You all thought favela world was a silly right-wing meme when it appeared a few years ago. But now the mayors of these cities are saying, get used to it, schmuck. It's part of modern life, schmuck. They're saying this. Well, it's not part of modern life in Warsaw, or Poland, or Tokyo, or Budapest somehow. And if you go to Tokyo, it's not exactly a backwater. It's a city out of the future with infrastructure and technology that doesn't exist in the West. Somehow these places have modern, advanced life, economic opportunities, but don't have to sacrifice a few of their own every year to terrorism, the way Athenians had to pay blood tribute to the Minotaur, the way you have supposedly to sacrifice your youth or your old now to terrorism. Apparently, it's possible to have a modern and urbane form of life without having your children be lectured to by priests of Cybele. You know what these were? They were self-castrated devotees of the Great Mother from Anatolia, a cult of perverted transsexuals that somehow insinuated themselves into late Roman life in antiquity. It is said the Roman emperor Elagabalus, of Syrian origin, I believe, it is said he was one of them. You want to hear what he did? He asked his doctors for a sex-change operation, but it didn't happen at the time. They didn't have the very advanced tools for this. I talk about this in my book. He prostituted himself in drag in the imperial palaces and gave himself airs over how much he was able to charge Johns. He was truly a man after the kidney of Trudeau, or Marco Rubio, or Comey, or Tony Blair, or any of the very special, very polite gentlemen who rule the West now, and who had special accounts inside the safes of Jeffrey Epstein. But apparently it's possible to have a modern cosmopolitan city without any of this. How is that? Well, it should be strange that the former domains of the Habsburgs are offering the most united shield in Europe against global faggotry. So I will discuss some of this history today. very unusual argument they make about how you could accept terrorism, how you must accept terrorism in your daily life. It made me think, how come it is that Japan or Poland or Hungary don't really have terrorism with any regularity? Of course, that could change, but up to now, where are the senseless daily attacks on pizzerias and such in these places? Monthly, whatever, yearly even attacks. Please don't mention Om Shinrikyo in Japan. I'm talking about something more recent than that, something that occurs with regularity, not as exception. No one in Tokyo fears that what happened in Paris could happen to them. What happened in Paris and in other European capitals with frequency. How come? Well, it's tempting to say that it's because there are no Muslims there, but that's not true either. You see, plenty of Muslims walk around as tourists. In Warsaw, in Budapest, in Tokyo. After all, these are cosmopolitan cities. They have better food and coffee than you, in fact. Don't worry, you regime lickspittle so-called hipsters. They have better food and coffee than you do. I heard one of these Maddow lookalike, Rachel Maddow lookalike new males at a sushi's restaurant in the United States. And he was praising globalism. He said, thank God for globalism. He said this to the sushi chef because he likes the sushi's creation of using, I don't know, he used olive oil on sashimi or something. Really impressed this hipster. They have that in Japan too. And they don't need to import Salvadoran gangbangers to teach them how to make a GMO corn tortilla. In fact, they ban GMOs in Japan because they care about their own citizens. They ban many other things too. But Japanese chefs can go anywhere in the world and learn foreign cuisines and come back. So you actually get very good Italian or French food in Tokyo if you want, but cooked by Japanese chefs. Wouldn't that be something if America funded its own young chefs to go abroad and learn instead of importing others to undercut their wages? A recipe is one of the easiest things to follow. And Japan, is also epicenter of global luxury trade. Many don't know this. If you go, even not the top tier supermarkets in Japan, you find luxury goods from all over the world that you can't find in other places. Every good, every produce has several grades. I had one of the most amazing apples I've ever had just casually walking through department stores there. And of course, many grades of coffee or various fruit you can't even find in their native countries. It all gets exported to the Japanese luxury market. For example, I think the largest mangoes in the world are grown in the northern Misiones province of Argentina. It's a place full of Polacks and Ukrainians, by the way, some Germans too, but they grow the biggest mangoes. Well, you're lucky if you can ever find one at markets in Buenos Aires because they all get exported to Japan only. So it's not like the Japanese are these yokels with no access to world markets or who ban tourists, but somehow they have no terror attacks, no knife attacks by Pakistanis in peace-stained robes. How is that? Well, I think the easy answer is that while there may be Muslim individuals, there is no Muslim community in Japan or in Poland. So you see, the whole doctrine of the lone wolf is bullshit. There is no lone wolf. All these Muslim terror attacks you see in the West are not really lone wolves. They have the support of the local Muslim community and the mosque, almost always, and often there's state support too from abroad, funding from Gulf states and such. It's actually harder to carry out these attacks than you think. It's never just some random. And that's the second part of the story. You know what else Japan, Hungary, and such do not have? They don't have the so-called counter-terrorism experts from the security establishment. What Gina Haspel sharpened her so-called claws doing. or not in any numbers or influence. It's hard, I know, for military and law enforcement loving conservatives to accept. But eventually, for your survival, you'll have to accept that counterterrorism establishment isn't there to stop any terror attacks. The counterterrorism expert is the mob boss who tells you, "Oh, I hear you had a pretty bad fall after goons break your legs throwing you down the stairs of your bar." Then you have to accept protection. That's all it is. And no, I am not saying they directly set up the terror attacks you see every now and then in the West, but they almost always are somehow involved in them, and they would cease to exist without a Muslim community to police. It's not just that the FBI had prior knowledge, for example, of the Orlando Islamic terror shooter or the Boston Chechen bombers, of every other pretty much terrorist that you hear. They were on the radar of FBI and such. But even more so, if you look at family backgrounds of those people I mentioned in particular, they were deeply connected with the American security and intelligence establishments. Look up who the uncle of the Tsarnaev brothers is and why they were let into the United States in the first place. Look up why the FBI turned a blind eye when Russia warned them that these guys had gone to Russia and had received training. By the way, on a small tangent subject, isn't it funny when they tell you that the government has all these amazing weapons and surveillance, and that therefore you cannot stop the government with your puny individual weapons? But then you see the Tsarnaev brothers were teenagers from the Caucasus with hardly any training, but they managed to shut down a big city for days and caused billions of dollars in damage. Isn't that weird? You know what else is weird? The way all these terrorists today attack nobodies, like a pizzeria, a discotheque. Why? It didn't used to be that way. It's just a historical oddity is all I am saying. Terrorists used to attack important people. It's hard to see how this thinking goes. You kill people in a pizza place and you change policy, but they must know by now this doesn't work. And the question, of course, is why no one important ever dies in a terror attack anymore. Look at who died on 9/11, by the way. The exception that proves the rule. Sure, some rich people you've never heard of died, but the only couple of well-known or important people who died that day were, I don't know, I don't want to say. You look up who they were. You see what you think. You look it up and see for yourself. But anyway, I'm saying Japan, Hungary, Poland, a few other places don't have this terror problem, nor the low-level crime problem caused by third world migrants, which actually takes more lives than terror. And they also have, of course, an entire economy and political establishment built up behind them in the West. I speak of the migrants now. That's another establishment that takes care of those, besides the counter-terror one. But when they tell you that you have to accept these degradations of your life to eat good ice cream or sushi, or to have good coffee, or to have access to brown people for sex, which of course is what really motivates many of these people, and worse. When they tell you this, just know it's all a lie, and it wouldn't be worth it, even if it were true. conservative respect for authority is not such a good thing. Not when a hostile elite has grafted itself onto the institutions of your nation and wears these like a skin, but otherwise perverts your legal system and perverts your words and your ideals and weaponizes them against you. White people see someone on trial and they figure in their innocence that anyone who's been caught up in the justice system must surely be a miscreant of some kind. The problem is the public relations machine that has a big hand in running the modern demagogue state. They know this about conservative white people and fool them, for example, by promoting men like Bob Mueller or John McCain, or know that loser Crenshaw to uphold their criminal policies. Part of it rests also on a misunderstanding about what compels men to join military life. I mentioned this on last show. And of course, I feel a little bit bad talking about this. I am not a veteran. So it should not be me saying this, but I will anyway. Physical courage is a virtue I have the most respect for, as you know, and it's a very necessary virtue, the most necessary of all, but it's not enough. It's rare, especially today, and very valuable because it's rare, in our time especially. But you can't necessarily trust a physically courageous man to be on your side, or not to be a shitbag in other ways. A robber, a vicious pirate. Very bad men of all kinds can be physically courageous. And the United States does not have a very good record, let's say, of military men making good leaders politically, even when they were well-intentioned. But people don't see this. They think men join the military because of high-minded devotion to country, that they are Boy Scouts, when in fact most often, and in the best case, they do it out of love of adventure and warfare. And in the worst case, they do it, I assume, just like Bob Mueller did, and just like friends I had did, because they desire a career in political life or the security state. They are toadies. It's possible to be a toady and physically courageous, rare but possible, and that's very cynical. But more frequent than, somebody who does it out of a devotion, or in the case of John McCain, who's a proven collaborator with the Vietnamese, who abandoned POWs in Vietnam, whose entire life was afflicted by disaster and misfortune that followed him and which he wrought and inflicted on others and on his country. The definition of a man hated by the gods, as the ancient Greeks feared. They were smarter than us. Odysseus once gets turned away because he might bring bad luck on his hosts. They knew this could happen. But in the case of John McCain, it's simply he was in the military because of nepotism. And that also happens. And the career of this man, Mueller, if you went back decades and studied it, he's always been the deep state's mercenary and cleanup man. Whenever they wanted someone to cover up their dirty work and their crimes, they put Mueller on the job. And the biggest case, I think, where he proved his loyalty is in the BCCI prosecutions. Do you know what BCCI is? Bank of Credit and Commerce International. It's very strange. No one has ever touched this except a few marginal people like me. And I wish someone mainstream would study it. Perhaps Tucker Carlson would study it and cover it on his show because it's so egregious. BCCI was the biggest corruption case in the history of America and possibly of the world. But you've never heard of it. You can get a good introduction. Actually, there is a June 2001 article in Wall Street Journal called A Few Questions for Mr. Mueller that provides a decent introduction to the affair. This article asks that Mueller no longer be considered for head of the FBI, as he was being considered that summer, because of his widely known lack of competence and in particular his lack of independence. They outright say he is a CIA agent or compromised by them in some way. The article focuses on the way he mishandled and apparently actually covered up the prosecutions around BCCI, which was an international bank in a sense, but in another sense it was a huge money laundering criminal enterprise. It was formerly a Pakistani bank, but actually an international cosmopolitan criminal enterprise that bribed politicians worldwide, that stole over $10 billion, that worked with terrorists and that worked with various intelligence agencies in money laundering. And this article calls it the most important corruption story of the 20th century. And it's so strange how utterly forgotten it is now. Mueller was in the early 1990s in charge of prosecuting some major figures involved with this criminal banking cartel. But he apparently obstructed New York and other states from investigating. He botched the prosecutions himself. He let these major characters off the hook in one way or another. This is a criminal conspiracy that this article itself, the Wall Street Journal, but of course many other sources you can research. This is a criminal conspiracy deeply tied, of course, to the political establishment of the United States and to the Central Intelligence Agencies. This article itself calls it. People connected to George Bush Sr. were involved. And it's widely assumed that the CIA was using BCCI for its own money laundering of various sorts, perhaps to Mujahideen in Pakistan, I don't know. And of course, in steps Mueller to hide all of their wrongdoings. Does this sound familiar to you? There's even a more serious side to this story. Although BCCI was formally dissolved and some of the main people prosecuted, they were let off the hook. So in fact, all the funding structure and all the people that were its nodes remained in place. And this was the network that Osama bin Laden also used for his funding and his financing before 9/11. How odd. Now you'll say I'm claiming Mueller is behind 9/11, but of course I could be saying something else. That like in the case of Tsarnaev brother and Orlan shooter, the security state in America somehow always seems to have some kind of involvement with major terrorists or with their funding schemes before they commit their acts. And of course, that doesn't mean evidence of collusion. It could just as well mean evidence they're retarded. It could mean they're morons. It could mean there's a good Luttwak interview, Edward Luttwak, where he talks about the Soviet Union and how when the archives of the KGB were opened after the Cold War, and he says, he referring to the United States now, we found out that our informants were actually their informants. Our guys were their guys. That the agent we thought we had turned and who had been executed for helping us was actually retired in a dacha outside of Moscow. And how basically the entire American intelligence apparatus had been completely ineffective at countering Russian intelligence, had been in fact itself penetrated and fucked every which way. It all started to go downhill after James Jesus Angleton. I've said this before. So this could be a case like that, where these morons like Mueller and company, and the other soccer moms running the American security establishment, who maybe thought that guys like Bin Laden were their guys, well, they got taken advantage of. Or were they erected, these criminal structures, because they thought they were spooks out of movies. But people smarter and wilier than them managed to subvert their own operations. Who knows? Or maybe it could be something worse than that. Why not? Well, I will get really crazy in the next segment. is really very odd that Mueller was appointed head of the FBI a day or a week, I think, before 9/11 happened. Am I allowed to say that? What about Gina Haspel, current head of the CIA? Do you know she was appointed to a crucial position just before 9/11? I mean, on that day. Is there anyone now prominent in the American security state, and in particular in the Russia hoax in some way, who was not involved with the prelude to 9/11 in just these weird, oh what ways? What? Look, you can call me a conspiracy theorist. Let me give you the government's official version. The official narrative is that 17 men of primarily shiftless Saudi extraction successfully hijacked 4 planes using nothing but improvised bladed instruments, and of those, 3 hit their intended targets with almost perfect accuracy, and the 4th one was in the skies for over 100 minutes without a single American air defense asset making so much as visual contact with it. And if you have any doubts about that story, you get called a conspiracy theorist. I'm not saying I know what happened. I just know they're lying. They could be lying about incompetence, by the way. You see how they try to trip me up now. They use Mindwave again. But you're saying it's the government's own story that 11 of the 19 hijackers were given visas by the same person working in the American consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Is that what you're saying? That is what they are saying. You're saying John Brennan, a former member of the Communist Party, and according to people who know him, a practicing Muslim. You are saying he was the CIA station chief in Jeddah at that time. What are you saying? You're saying the American people have no right to notice these oddities, or to ask, for example, that consular official who gave 11 of the 19 visas, to question them about how and why those visas were granted. So now again, I'll be called 9/11 conspiracy theorist, a 9/11 truther, and I don't really care if they call me this, but I should say what I mean here. I was, in a way, just like them. I always look down on this stuff. And I'm not saying that just for rhetorical effect. I think I'm on the record somewhere laughing at the 9/11 truthers. But my main reasoning in this is this incompetent government can't run a post office. How are they somehow going to pull off a complicated false flag like this? Moldbug made a similar point in a recent article, and I agree with this. But it's not really the point here. First of all, I have no theory really about what happened that day. But this will not stop me from pointing out absurdities within the government's own story. And it won't stop me from believing that the government, of course, lies to you. Unlike other conspiracy theorists, I don't actually claim to know what happened. It should be mentioned here, however, that the most advanced so-called 9/11 people don't believe, for example, that it was an inside job carried out by Rumsfeld or Cheney. And they indeed believe this to be a misdirection. They believe rather that Israel did it, or that it did so together with a faction within the American government, not the government as a whole. And they have their own reasons to believe that. I direct you to Ron Unz articles on this matter. Ron Unz, the famous neo-Nazi, yes? The neo-Nazi who grew up speaking Yiddish, who's a Silicon Valley guy, that neo-Nazi. Anyway, he covers this stuff better than I can here. If you're interested in that theory, you can go read him. His American Pravda series, very interesting. I have no idea what the real story is. But I'll tell you, for example, you can start with common sense. I never believed, for example, the government story about what happened to the plane in Pennsylvania. the one that was meant for the capital. Their story, of course, is too good to be true. Some rainbow coalition of gays and women took over the plane and heroically crashed it. And there's a movie about this too. But I think it's far more likely that it was shot down by the Air Force to prevent this plane from attacking Washington, D.C., which of course would have been justified, but it's not something they can admit. It's very interesting, however, their story is the people on this plane found out what was going on by using their cell phones. And somehow people all these years have believed that. Please answer. If you turn on your cell phone on an airplane today, 20 years later, do you get a signal? You often can't get a signal in some parts of an apartment building in a city. There is no signal today in an airplane. They didn't have phones on planes back then either, I believe. I mean, that's just an obvious lie. They've told this lie all these years, and people have believed them. So it might lead you to question what other lies they told. I don't know, but you should read their own story about the Pentagon attack, for example. And I mean this. Go read the government's own story, okay? See what you think, because that's what I'm telling you here. They tell patent absurdities and count on you not bothering to read their own story, which I didn't bother to do all these years myself. You want to know what they say happened at the Pentagon? Okay, they say a plane crashed into this section of the Pentagon. And by the way, you should go look at the video because it was only just released this year. Oh yes, it was only released this year as part of a FOIA request by Judicial Watch. So just go look at it. What do you see? I'm not sure what I see in that video, but it's not a civilian airliner. It's not any kind of plane, I think. It's hard to make out what it is because it's so fast. Even if you stop it frame by frame, it's hard to make out. But one thing you can see is that it hits the Pentagon not from above, but from the side. It's flying horizontally and hits it from the side, and it's obvious from the film that whatever it is, it had been flying yards above the ground for some time, parallel to the ground, and that it's not really that big. I don't know, can a civilian airliner fly yards above the ground horizontally like that at that kind of speed? Anyway, look at the video, and I believe Tom Fitton of Judicial Watch is being very sneaky. He has on this tweet with the video the caption that he requested the video to put to rest conspiracy theories regarding what happened that day at the Pentagon. But of course it does no such thing because that's not a plane you're seeing in the film. And moreover, here's the thing about the Pentagon story. They say, and this is the government story now, they say that the only people who died that day inside the Pentagon, or rather the people who mostly died, the people who all died, rather the bullseye hit was on this section of the Pentagon that was researching a missing $2 trillion. And that's right, I said $1 trillion. That had only been announced as missing early that September. You can look this up, it's in mainstream news sources as well. Trillions of dollars that went missing under William Cohen's tenure as defense secretary during Clinton's years. And you know what? Every single person in that section investigating this died. Not only that, but that's where they stored all the documents for this investigation. So, poof, bam, all the documents were destroyed in the attack, and there could be no further investigation of missing trillions of dollars. And here is the real punchline. Are you ready? Now, this isn't a conspiracy theorist lunatic saying this. This is, again, the government's own story. But you know, the head of that investigation, the head of that unit in the Pentagon, he was supposed to be out of town that day, right? He was supposed not to be there, and in fact, he wasn't. But the government says that he was on the plane that got hijacked and fell into his own section. Amazing, right? I mean, what are the odds? That's really odd, yes? Am I allowed to notice that is very odd? Now do that times 100, because there's sloppy stuff like that all over the government story about that day, in other parts too. You see, this was before the internet, before social media really. ABC News just posted fake videos that they doctored, claiming to show Kurds being massacred, but it was really a gun range from America, I think Kentucky. Look at the fake testimony given before the first Gulf War, where they had the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter go before Congress and pose as oppressed random poor girl who had been abused by the Iraqis. All fake. These are documented cases of fraud to drive you to war. I don't know. You think I have a right to find stuff like that Pentagon 9/11 government's own story very odd? I'm just saying it's very odd, that's all. But let me move from this to historical matters that are more pleasant. Thank you. This question of the Habsburgs has upset me for some time now. You know, I can't give you a complete history of this house right now, this dynasty, which would of course necessarily also be a complete history of Europe almost. Maybe someday, when I do these historical shows like the Angola one, many of you love it, but if you complain that it's too basic and you already know all the facts. I try in any case to present things in the context of my own concerns. In the case of the Habsburgs, these are for me both personal and mystical. Mystical because I'm very interested in Melania Trump and I believe she is a powerful witch. I love her. She is descended from the line of the Dukes of Carniola, which were part of the Habsburg Empire. I have discussed this before, but I am under gag order no longer to talk about. But my personal reasons for being interested in this dynasty is because their story since World War I isn't really told, and they love to hide, okay? They love to hide. Have you seen the movie Reversal of Fortune? It's about the case that really made Alan Dershowitz famous. He got a guy acquitted on appeal who had been accused of trying to murder his wife. He was a European aristocrat named Klaus von Bülow, who had married an American heiress. Now, he was supposedly an impoverished aristocrat in this kind of old type. But it's interesting that his wife, his sugar mama, that she had kept the name of her previous Eurotrash aristocrat husband, and this was Auersperg. Auersperg. Now, who are the Auerspergs? The Auerspergs, it is a branch of the ruling families of the Austro-Hungarian or Habsburg realms, originally descended from valorous warriors. But what's interesting is the extent to which they actually kept unspeakable wealth after the empire was taken apart at the end of World War I. This woman, Sonny Auersperg, was wealthy beyond imagining, even at the time, and it goes the story that she had her wealth from her American father. But I believe much of it was laundered. In other words, it had belonged secretly to her Auersperg prince husband. I'm not complaining about any of this. The unspeakable wealth that they hid after the war. I'm not complaining. But I think the idea of hidden wealth is fascinating. Many moved to Argentina and Uruguay after World War I and in the 1920s, and you may find in the wilds there hidden estates of unspeakable opulence. And I'm not allowed to say more. I may have run naked through Auersperg woods at night in Uruguay. I cannot tell you more. But it's interesting they should choose these countries. On paper, Argentina is so poor. I haven't looked up the figures lately, but it might even be at Ukraine levels, formally. But you know, that's on paper. And there's a lot that these studies of economic statistics don't tell you, because these are, of course, statistics supplied by formal state organs usually. So why would you rely on them? They're lies. Why, in the same sense, should you believe test scores when China reports them? I saw an article just yesterday about how Asian students' test scores were thrown out for cheating. And of course, if you went to school where there was any large Asian, and in particular Chinese community of students, it's all a giant cheating operation. They'd keep exams and assignments over many generations of students, and then essentially wrote and memorized them. That is Chinese high IQ excellence for you. Bring them in by the millions. Let them write your spaghetti code. Let them build your bridges. You'll be very safe. High IQ. You buy cheap. Buy cheap now. Is cheap you buy now. Anyway, where was I? Yes. So there's a lot of hidden wealth in these countries, like Argentina, I think. If you go on the street in Buenos Aires, you see, still now, after all their decline, you see amazing elegance and opulence, and it's far beyond what you see in many American and European cities, not just one block, but block after block. I'm sure my Argentinian friends will object, but they're perpetual Italian complainers. And sure, it has declined considerably. Even so, it is still quite rich. Something similar existed in ancient Greece. I mentioned in a previous episode that all that mass production of high-quality weapons, and especially ships, you know, the triremes, the ships they had, attained speeds that were unequaled, I think, until the modern era. They had actually very advanced technology. But all this required factories, workshops, and capital and financing. And of course, modern capitalism did not exist. But a kind of hidden economy, a kind of hidden quasi-capitalism did. Much of it was run by women and slaves, but the heads of Athenian houses, and it was the same in other cities, they financed overseas ventures, trading, and you got back a return on your capital the same way that happened, for example, in the age of exploration much later in Europe. And that happens now. People who invested, for example, in Vasco da Gama's voyage to India got something like 3,000% return on that. It's not a small reason these things happen, but partly to escape the onerous taxation, partly because commerce was seen as ignoble. A lot of this almost capitalism took place hidden and wouldn't have shown up on any public accounts. I think, by the way, that's a better way to do this, you know, because you don't want the vile merchant to become an accepted figure in your country. If you let that happen, it's only a short step from the merchant to Barney Frank as a respected public figure. But the point is, I think something similar takes place even in modern Greece, and certainly in Argentina, which consistently tops the charts as the most corrupt place in the world, maybe beyond African corruption even. That's what happens when you have a country of Spaniards and Italians. And you can add to it Lebanese, Syrians, and wild Ashkeys to make it really spicy, and you get Argentina. So, well, of course, then the wealth is hidden, and I'd say justly so in many cases, to escape confiscatory taxation. But there are arguments that the old houses of Europe, that for example the British royal house similarly has hidden vast wealth, that the Rothschilds and Rockefellers too are far wealthier than is known by public accounts. And in any case, I believe this to be true also of the Habsburgs, of the Auerspergs, and some of the other Austrian princely families. They have vast hidden wealth in South America and many other places. And there's a theory, I'll tell you, you want conspiracy? There is a wild theory that what you see now with mass Mexican and Catholic Central American migration into the United States, that this is the Habsburg revenge in the New World, the Habsburg and Spanish revenge on England, that this whole thing that trad cats, or rather fed cats like Dosat or Vermeulen are pushing, where they want an America's white empire called Our Lady of Guadalupe or something, that this is all hidden Habsburg revanchism. And I mean, just look at how they put Schwarzenegger, the Austrian bodybuilder, plant, how they put him in charge of California at a crucial time, and how his wife was a Catholic Kennedy. That's all part of this same Habsburg plot to take back America, to take back the Americas, to destroy the Anglo pattern of settlement and Anglo way of life, and to promote instead Habsburg dominion the way they tried to do in Mexico before. Wake up! But who were the Habsburgs and why important? Well, everyone knows it was a German dynasty, and actually I believe originally Swiss, or at least their ancestral castle is in present-day Switzerland, North Switzerland. And through wile, but mostly through wile and trickery, but also through valor, they managed to gain for themselves vast territories in Europe. These included not just Austria proper and Bohemia, but also at times Spain, where a branch of their family ruled and through Spanish navy conquered much of the world, settled many continents, settled the Americas. That's where I believe the saying, the sun never sets on, comes from. The sun never sets on the House of Habsburg, because their dominion spanned the world through Spanish holdings. They inherited in this way also, through prudent marriage practices, they inherited the so-called Low Countries, Flanders, Belgium, Holland. I'm sorry I have to tell my Dutch friends, the Spanish tried their best to civilize you barbarians, but you revolted against their rule because of your Protestantism and your barbaric love of freedom and independence. And in this revolt against Spanish Habsburg rule, you have also the birth of the modern Netherlands, which became a great Protestant commercial state with its own worldwide holdings and interests. I will cover in more detail the Dutch East Indies another time and the story about modern-day Timor and the foolishness of the modern left and the mendaciousness of Noam Chomsky in the Timor and other affairs regarding Indonesia. But Charles V, he was head of the Habsburgs at the time in the 1500s, of the largest extent of Habsburgs both in Europe and outside. And he had a motto, Charles V, plus ultra. What it mean? This was Habsburg Emperor. He was referring to the previous motto, well known in Europe, ancient motto, ne plus ultra, or non plus null ultra, meaning not beyond, which referred to the Straits of Gibraltar, and the fact that in the ancient world it was assumed no land lay west of that on the great ocean. Of course, I don't believe this story, but okay. But that was the motto, meaning you should not sail beyond the Gibraltar, not go beyond, but in a spirit of brave defiance, of limitlessness, of Faustian reaching on exploration. With a Bronze Age mindset, Charles V chose the opposite as his motto, plus ultra. And it had become the motto of Spain today. It has become. I believe also that Trump has been photographed, strangely enough, with this motto behind him. But this was, in any case, the point of Habsburg peak under Charles V in the 1500s. He has amazing, awesome armor too. You can find it black with gold engravings, beautiful. Thereafter came a long decline, although it didn't necessarily feel that way. The Habsburgs had a major role to play in the disaster of the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, as they did in almost every great European happening, but it was that war that really changed things for them, I think. I mentioned in a previous show the good book by C.V. Wedgwood that you could read on the 30 Years' War. Very entertaining and contains much also on Habsburg history if you're interested. But it is the tail end of this story in the 19th century and before World War I that I find most interesting. Many parallels to the modern world, many parallels to America. Throughout this show I have used Mahler's Symphony No. 5. Now it is the Waltz of Strauss that I play at the beginning of every show, and the famous Blue Danube Waltz. And I could have tried to use this for this whole show again, but somehow I thought Mahler more appropriate, because there's this other side to the Vienna and to the Austrian Empire of that time, this moody, neurotic, dark side that comes out better in the neurotic Mahler's music. And there is also good music by Strauss called the Radetzky March. But then if you want the dark side of that, there is a book by the same name, Radetzky March, by Joseph Roth, who was a Jewish journalist and wrote this dark, depressing book about a declining Austrian house. Much the same as you'd expect a journalist of that persuasion to write, I suppose. But actually, it's far beyond what's on offer today in terms of quality. For the true mood of turn-of-century Vienna, I recommend for you again the writer Robert Musil, his first book, Confessions of Young Torless, which is about dominated by dog but set in an Austrian boarding school. Apparently it made Freud chimp. And then there's his masterpiece, Robert Musil's masterpiece, The Man Without Qualities, which is considered one of the great three super novels in the vein of Proust or Joyce, but maybe superior to both of them. It's a strange story about Vienna and Europe before World War I, and the story of a man who you might find you have a lot in common with. So I recommend all these books for reading if you want the mood of that time. It's a dark and a lost mood, despite the considerable prosperity and freedom of the place, to which I will now go to talk. But please, Maria, why you do this? Maria, my maid, and to spite me, Maria's my maid, and to spite me, she has put her sweat all over my covers. I smell it. It's disgusting. Maria, where are you? You Maria! My maid has poisoned me before. I asked her for a beef stew and she put poison because the radio stations here tell her the blue-eyed devils who came to oppress and enslave her people centuries ago. Of course, she is 100% Iberian and is probably whiter than I am, but there you have it. People will believe anything. I'll tell you all about this on next show, why not? Or I may have to write about that for full elaboration. The meaning of whiteness, the whole history of so-called white identity, because as with so many other matters, I believe both sides are propagandizing it in a way that obscures the truth from you. And that makes political organization so much harder for us. But this is related to the Austrian case because, it was a multicultural, multi-ethnic empire in the center of Europe where people with generally quite strong tribal identities have long existed. But it managed to unite them for some time until at least end of 19th century and into the 20th. Resurgence of ethnic nationalism, you could say, began to tear it apart, or so the story goes. The old story, the mayor of Vienna, who was a well-known anti-Semite, who inspired Hitler, and again, so the story goes. But let's look beyond this somewhat propagandized image. How were the Habsburgs able to hold together this diverse empire in the center of Europe? It is not, as some claim, because all the peoples under their rule were Catholics. It was much more a direct loyalty to the Habsburgs themselves than even that. Direct loyalty to Habsburg emperor or house, beyond the Catholic identity. But beyond even that, it was economic freedom. And forgive if I repeat myself, I think I said before that this economic freedom had come to be the ideology, or rather the lived practice of the Habsburg dominions during the reign of the last emperor. It was an Anglophile empire, actually. And it's not a coincidence that Mises and the whole Austrian school of economics bears that name. But it came out of the laissez-faire policies and the great economic freedoms and prosperity that the Austrian Empire provided to its subjects. It was the only glue, really, to hold all these disparate peoples together. Even so, don't imagine that such peoples were forcibly mixed by the Habsburgs the way that America destroys freedom of association for whites in the United States. Rather, Vienna and a few urban centers were the only places where any mixing, so to speak, or even contact between the different groups took place, the different ethnic groups. Beyond that, old hostilities never really ceased. And the Austrians tried to bring in, for example, the Hungarians as equals within the Dominion to assuage some of these ethnic rivalries in the 19th century. This worked only to some very limited extent. It managed to win, for the most part, the loyalties of the Jews by providing them with full equality. And it was within the Austrian Empire, actually, that Jews acquired titles of nobility, going as far back, I believe, even as late 1700s. Noble titles which you could get by being successful in any number of areas of life. This is quite unlike certain other cosmopolitan empires like the Byzantine, the Russian, or the ancient Roman, which had always very tense relationships with their own Jews, as with also other minorities that didn't want to assimilate or could not be assimilated. But that's perhaps because those were in belief and in practice very unlike the Austrian Habsburg dominions. And not that this is the most important matter, but it does show really how different and unusual was this so-called empire as opposed to any other. It was not really an empire. You read a story, The Good Soldier Schweik, about the military, the incompetent military and bureaucracy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You see, the ethnic element never really disappeared. But it was really a realm of freedom. And when you see, for example, someone like Friedrich von Hayek refer to the liberty that existed in Europe before 1914, he's talking also in large part about life in Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many times I like to riff on how unfree you are compared to many other parts of the past, and even compared to certain modern dictatorships or failed regimes. And I think that's true. But in many cases, that could be because of incompetence on the part of the rulers, or because they didn't have the technology to oppress their subjects. But in the case of the Habsburgs in around 1900, let's say, it's beyond that. I believe it really was a realm of liberty and freedom as a matter of principle and ideal. And although we've become accustomed on our side to scoff at these things, we really scoff at things that are not these things but pretend to be, that are lies. I think we should keep in mind that's mostly because of what we have now goes by that name, but really isn't that. It's really a kind of authoritarianism that wears the skin of liberty. And Paul Ryan is basically a gay faggot who uses these words without knowing what they mean. But it really existed in the Vienna of 1900. And although that's not my favorite place or time in the world, we shouldn't be foolish and believe that it was just like our time. In fact, it exceeded our time in so many ways, in the liberty given to the individual, and thereby, most of all, also in its art and literature, which is a great achievement of mankind, and which I will try very briefly to discuss in closing segment. Loves to attack the bourgeois, and many of you do as well, but you must stop it. I am not a fan of Alan Bloom, but he's right when he points out that Nietzsche said so long ago now how stupid it is to attack the bourgeois with that word. The danger of our time is not the bourgeois. If only we had the bourgeois of Vienna or Paris of 1900. It is, as Nietzsche reminds you, the last man, which is something far lower and more aggressive than the bourgeois, which is the regime of our time, the regime of the last man, the union between a demented ruling class and the mass of lumpen proles and biological defectives that it weaponizes against the middle classes and ultimately against the very idea of normality and biological health. Because when they've wiped out the middle class, they've wiped out the last reservoir of resistance to their tyranny, and they've moved you to a pod. You're now a pod. Your spine will have a chip implant, so that a beige creature of undetermined species and gender can electrocute you from remotely from Tampa drone farm. No, we face something far worse than the bourgeois. And Vienna as well as Paris of 1900. These present us with the high culture of bourgeois life. They show you the great achievements that this society was capable of. Of course, part of it was always to shit somewhat on bourgeois mores and culture, but that's par for the course, and it matters a great deal what direction you do that from. But for example, I mentioned Proust, which I believe is a great bourgeois spiritual achievement. Marcel Proust, one of the great peaks of bourgeois art. And so is the music of Mahler. So is the literature, for example, in the Austrian case of Hofmannsthal. The paintings of Klimt, the stories of Kafka. I don't want to just list them more than I could list here, but you get the idea. What today is like that? In the style of Art Deco architecture, the high achievements of bourgeois society of the time in science and mathematics and so on, all of this is so much far beyond what exists now that I find shitting on the bourgeois as such to be absurd. Even Freud, I know many of you dislike Freud, but actually Camille Paglia is right that when you read Freud, even if he's wrong, you see it's a great intellectual achievement, the way he has incredibly long arcs of argument to make a powerful case, a powerful, long, sustained argument. No one today can do that almost. Of course, in the end, it's just denatured Nietzscheanism or Schopenhauerism, which I think Freud himself admitted. And of course, Cudahy, Jean Murray Cudahy, ultimately, he has Freud's number. By the way, if you read any book on Freud, read Cudahy's Ordeal of Civility, because the things he uncovers there about Freud, his private life, his letters, are in my opinion unarguable. It's a slam punk case. But even so, Freud, even with all those faults, is far beyond what any modern society seems to be capable of in terms of cultural and literary production. I will cover, I think, on future show, maybe Hofmannsthal and Musil very closely. I will have shows in future that deal exactly, entirely, with good books or literature maybe. But if you read those two, Hofmannsthal and Musil, you get a sense of Vienna around turn of century and the very high level of bourgeois society unattainable for us. But consider for a moment Arthur Schnitzler, another writer. He was, I think, a journalist and a writer, also of the age, writing around 1900, but he had a very peculiar story called Dream Story, Traumnovelle. Dream Story, you can get it. And this story, not very long, was the source of Stanley Kubrick's movie Eyes Wide Shut, in which he basically copied this Arthur Schnitzler story from turn of century Vienna, and he set it in modern New York. I think something was lost in this translation, and if you read that story by Schnitzler, you get a better sense of what this tale means. Of course, Kubrick was assassinated by the Lords of Lies for exposing them in this movie. That ritual, I'm trying to tell you something. There was something similar, even though it's presented as a psychodrama or an exploration of sexual psychology and such. In fact, that doesn't interest me so much. I believe Schnitzler, like Kubrick, was pointing to something similar going on in the Austria of the time. In the realm of freedom, developed something hidden, a great hidden force, something old, a hidden secret that congregates in rituals of great antiquity, that gets preserved and passed down from mentor to mentee. Although most of the initiates, of course, are a pathetic rabble of people who need to feel something in their empty lives, and their small spirits, their shadows, ensnared by Epstein and his handlers. They are nothing but hidden behind them, nevertheless. The people drawing the strings. There are several factions. In Hong Kong, there was a man who wore green gloves. The Green Dragon. I can say no more. I can say nothing.